Hey there folks, it's Matthew Seville here with SLRlounge.com. In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I use picture controls or picture styles to kind of help my artistic vision when I'm out in the field shooting landscape photos. This clip that you're seeing here is actually unedited straight out of the camera. It's the black and white picture style, picture control on my Nikon D5200. So I was just doing this to show you guys, give you guys a little example. Obviously I wouldn't shoot professional video, with in-camera black and white turned on, but let's talk about why you would want to use it for raw photo capture, for landscape or outdoor photography, where it's all about shooting raw. And when you shoot raw, if you edit your photos in an Adobe program or something, as we know, those picture controls go away. So let me show you what my camera is seeing up here on this perch that I've got. I'm waiting for sunrise, and obviously it's a little bit too bright, so let me darken it. And clearly, honestly, it's just not really working for me. I mean, I love dark silhouettes and stuff, but this picture style, this black and white picture style, is definitely of no use just because of the dynamic range that's going on here. So let me show you what this scene would look like if I were to use the standard picture control, picture style. And here we are with standard. And by the way, when I say picture control and picture style, and I say both of those phrases interchangeably, that's because it's called picture control on Nikon cameras, and it's called picture styles on Canon cameras. And on any brand camera, you're gonna have basically those, faithful, neutral, vivid, or landscape, or portrait, all of those different kinds of styles. Here, for example, I just switched to vivid picture control, and you can see I've got more contrast, more saturation, and obviously these shadows are just toasted. So let's get into why I would want to tweak these settings as an outdoor photographer if whenever I'm shooting raw, all these controls go away. Now here's neutral picture control, and you can tell that I'm looking into the shadows a little bit better. But what happens if I turn the contrast way down and I turn on the active delighting, or the shadow highlight? All the cameras have their different dynamic range type of controls. And again, aside from that thing I did with the black and white mode, I haven't changed my exposure at all. These are all the same exact exposure, but now I can see into those shadows very, very well, and I can see these highlights. I think I want to darken it just a little bit, maybe a stop or so, a little bit more than a stop, so that I can just barely see these highlights, and so that I can see, a little bit of detail in these shadows. Actually, I think I went too far. Let's brighten it up just a little bit, maybe a stop or so, and let's capture a picture right here with these camera settings and see how it turns out. Sure enough, here we are in Lightroom. The image looks slightly different than it did in the video because this was a raw capture that I exported from Nikon View NX as a JPEG so that we could see the JPEG in-camera settings and the raw Adobe editing side by side. But anyways, the main thing to note here is that I can just barely see my highlights, and I've got plenty of shadow detail, which was completely impossible in the other camera settings and without the contrast and active delighting adjustments that I was showing you earlier. And this image, especially the shadows, definitely look a little bit flat, but the whole point is for me to just see the amount of dynamic range that the camera is actually capturing, so that I know, how far I can dig into the shadows with this camera, or whether or not I'm actually blowing my highlights compared to the other picture styles, which may have misrepresented those, the blacks and the highlight points. In any case, it looks like I nailed the exposure. I've just barely got some highlights, and I've definitely got plenty of digging that I can do in the shadows here. So let me show you what the raw, this is what the raw photo looks like in Adobe Lightroom. Of course, it's got much worse dynamic range. There's not much color at all going on here because this is completely unedited. Let me hit escape here and come back to Lightroom. And let's try to process this photo so that it looks something like this original that I captured in camera, with these beautiful colors in the sky here. This is just around sunrise down at the beach in Corona del Mar here in Orange County. Let me see about what I want to do. I definitely am going to go into the vivid presets in my SLR Lounge preset system here. Let's go straight to HDR Max color. And let's hit that on the raw photo here. Let's not try and edit the JPEG photo. And hey, that's looking pretty incredible. I actually may have gone too far with this. Let's try HDR heavy color instead of max. This actually looks really great. I might just want to boost up my shadows and blacks a tiny bit more, and maybe the exposure a tiny bit overall. I can't really tell, but I know I want to retain as much of these highlights as possible without it getting that weird HDR look where, you know, the area around the sky gets completely funky looking. And this right here, in my opinion, looks perfect. Let's go back here and see again what it looked like in camera. I'm just barely preserving a little bit more highlights here. Maybe it's a little bit too dark. Let me bring the whites up, bring the highlights up just a tiny bit more. Again, this is a very delicate dance that I'm going to do here. And if I wanted to, I could definitely attack this image with some graduated neutral density filters and stuff like that. But since I seem to have so much highlight data here to preserve, I almost want to consider going back to the real world here and adjusting my exposure just a little bit brighter to see if I can squeeze any more highlights out of this so that my shadow detail is a little bit less noisy. I don't think I have much noise in here as it is, but I could always, you know, stand to do a little bit better. Anyways, let's go back and let's brighten up our exposure just a little bit to see what that does for us. And maybe I'll go up a stop or so. I want to demonstrate so that we can see where in these highlights I may be, you know, just losing it a tiny bit. And sure enough, here we are back in Lightroom, and you can see with this in-camera editing that I probably have just barely blown my highlights. But as a test, and you should all do this with your own respective cameras, let's go into the raw image and see just what level of highlights we can recover from this particular camera. Here's the raw file, and you can definitely see that I'm missing a little bit of highlights here. But since Adobe Lightroom, especially Lightroom 4 and Lightroom 5, are so awesome at recovering stuff, let's see what the HDR Max preset does. Yep, see, sure enough, there's a good amount of detail. I'm not going to say plenty of detail, but there's a good amount of detail here. And I've almost got it back to everything perfect, just as tiny, except for just this tiny little section here. So let's play around with it a little bit. Maybe I want to lower the contrast a tiny bit and a little bit less clarity, maybe something like this. I definitely think that this looks good. Let's compare it to the other exposure that we made that was just a little bit darker. And honestly, I think that this one has a little bit smoother highlight area here compared to this, where you can definitely tell that it's just starting to get a little bit too bright. So it's going to be a matter of personal taste, but I think the perfect exposure is somewhere either here or somewhere in between. And finding this specific point should be your ultimate goal with using picture controls like this in camera, so that you can finally gauge where your highlights and shadows are on the back of your camera. That's definitely the most important thing for all of us to remember when we're picking up a camera and we're trying to master it. You know, be able to discern what your camera LCD is showing you and relate that to what it's going to give you on the back end, you know, depending on whatever raw editing program you might use. Anyways, before we wrap up, let me show you a few other images that I captured while I was shooting this beautiful sunrise, just to give you guys an example of what I'm talking about and what your in-camera picture controls are capable of in the first place. Now, here's a black and white version of that same scene with the active delighting and the contrast turned way down like I was telling you before. And you can see there's a lot of detail in the shadows and there's a good amount of detail in the highlights. I'm not sure if that's, you know, fully retained there. But if I wanted to, I could process this raw photo here. This is the raw version of this in-camera black and white. And it looks like, for example, let's go into the develop module and let's hit the HDR heavy grunge B&W for this image. Ooh, that looks pretty cool. Let's try HDR Max B&W. Well, I'm definitely digging this. I think I need to brighten it up a little bit. But anyways, you see what I mean? I'm using the in-camera picture style, let's go back to this, to kind of foresee my overall vision for the final image as it looks like, as it appears like this. And I think there's a few other images here that I want to show you, so let's go through this really quick. And let me turn on my filters here. So we saw these photos, the color versions. But then after the sun came up, I went down on the beach and I got some more fun photos back in the black and white mode. And these are, again, unedited, completely straight out of the camera. So obviously I might bring the raw photo into Lightroom for a little tweaking, but this is my main artistic vision, and the reason that I use black and white picture control in camera is so that I can tell, the artistic value of a photo. And say, for example, this one I found this, this beach this sand to be kind of distracting because of the leading lines and stuff. So I moved on and, found a different composition. But being able to simplify my vision and see it in black and white really helped. Here's another few photos that are really cool. Maybe this would be, a decent panorama. And I thought the wave kind of looking right here with the sun reflecting off it was really cool. And I shot this with the camera settings set to black and white because I knew that that was what I really wanted to go for with the final image, and I just wanted to see if it would look awesome or not, on the back of the camera. So I think it turned out. Here is a version, here's a couple photos that are taken with the vivid in-camera picture control, and you can see, I've got a lot of popping colors, I've got a lot of contrast, and compared to using a very flat neutral picture style, this kind of helped me achieve my creative vision overall for this scene. Of course, if you don't feel comfortable messing around with your picture controls, or if you shoot video, I highly recommend, just leaving it in neutral or faithful. Neutral's usually pretty good, and both Canon and Nikon have it. So if you want to get the best, most accurate representation, just leave your camera in neutral picture control and, leave the contrast and saturation about normal. But in my experience, if you want to really test your dynamic range, or if you really want to, try and see your artistic vision beforehand, I highly recommend playing around just a little bit and kind of seeing what you can come up with. That's all for now, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in, and take care.